October 14th, 1944 500 hours Lady Gulf, Philippines. Through the Preed, on darkness, Corporal Thomas Eugene Jean Patterson crouched motionless in a camouflaged position overlooking a Japanese command post. But what made this morning different from hundreds of other sniper operations across the Pacific wasn't the shooter's skill or his weapon. It was what stood 15 FT to his left. A crude scarecrow constructed from bamboo poles, rice straw, and a captured Japanese helmet. The figure slouched against a tree in what appeared to be a sniper's firing position, complete with a stick protruding forward to simulate a rifle barrel. To Japanese observers scanning the tree line, it looked exactly like an American sniper who'd chosen a terrible position, completely exposed to counter-fire. What the Japanese officers gathering near their command bunker didn't know was that this scarecrow was bait. Eugene Patterson, the Nebraska farmer who'd spent his entire childhood building decoys to hunt waterfowl, had just perfected the deadliest variation of a technique he'd learned at age 10. Over the next 16 days, this scarecrow sniper method would account for 21 confirmed Japanese officer kills, fundamentally disrupting enemy command structure across an entire division. The Japanese spotters who detected the suspicious figure through their binoculars were about to learn that sometimes the most dangerous enemy isn't the one you can see. It's the one you think you can see. While the real threat watches from somewhere else entirely, the innovation that would define those 16 days had begun 7 0 miles away in a place that seemed impossibly distant from Philippine jungles, Kearney County, Nebraska. Population density 2. 3 persons per square mile, a landscape of endless wheat fields broken only by occasional farmhouses and the Central Platte River winding through the plains. Thomas Eugene Patterson had been born May 7, 1922, on a modest farm that his grandfather had homesteaded in 1887. The farm barely supported the family through the Depression, and by age 8, Gene was expected to contribute. His father, Samuel Patterson, made the situation clear. We can't afford to waste anything. Not seed, not water, not ammunition. You want to hunt, you learn to make every shot count. But Nebraska waterfowl hunting presented unique challenges. Ducks and geese were wary, intelligent, and learned quickly to avoid areas where they'd been shot at. Young hunters who simply walked up and started shooting would see birds for maybe one morning. After that, the flocks would avoid those areas entirely. Gene's grandfather, Elias Patterson, taught him a different approach. Decoys, if you can make birds believe an area is safe, make them think other birds are already there feeding peacefully, they'll come right to you. But the decoys have to be perfect. Birds can spot something wrong from hundreds of yards up. By age 12, Gene was building his own decoys. He carved wooden duck shapes, painted them with painstaking accuracy, and positioned them in patterns that mimicked natural feeding behavior. But his real innovation came in creating movement. Static decoys worked, but moving decoys worked better. Gann developed spring mechanisms that created subtle head movements, anchoring systems that allowed decoys to bob naturally in water, and even crude motorized devices that generated ripples. The results were remarkable. While other hunters struggled to bring down 1 or 2 ducks per morning, Gene regularly limited out, taking his legal maximum because birds flew right into his perfectly arranged decoy spreads. He'd learned a fundamental truth that would prove devastatingly applicable to warfare. If you can make the enemy believe they see something they expect to see, they'll ignore everything else while focusing on the decoy. His younger sister Mary later recalled in a 1989 interview, Gene could make decoys that fooled even experienced hunters. He'd set up his spread, hide in the blind, and people walking past would sometimes shoot at his decoys thinking they were real birds. He thought it was hilarious, said if his fakes could fool humans, they'd definitely fool ducks. The decoy principle extended beyond waterfowl. Gene hunted coyotes using fake rabbits. He trapped foxes using artificial bait stations that looked natural, but were carefully designed to channel animals into specific positions. He even experimented with scarecrows in the family's cornfield, creating human-shaped figures that moved slightly in the wind, keeping birds away through psychological intimidation rather than physical barriers. These experiments occurred purely from necessity and curiosity. Jean never imagined they had military applications. He was just a farm kid trying to hunt efficiently and protect crops. The idea that these techniques would disrupt Japanese military operations never crossed his mind. Pearl Harbor changed everything. Jean enlisted December 9, 1941, 2 days after the attack. At the recruiting station in Grand Island, he listed his occupation as farmer and hunter. The recruiter, noting his background, suggested he consider specialist roles like reconnaissance or scouting, but Jean ended up in standard infantry. His basic training at Fort Ord, California, was unremarkable. He qualified expert rifleman, scoring 234 out of 240 on the qualification course. Good, but not exceptional. His drill instructors noted he was a competent soldier, but showed no particular distinction. What the instructors missed was Jean's unconventional thinking. During a training exercise on camouflage and concealment, Jean suggested that effective camouflage wasn't just about hiding. It was about creating false targets that drew enemy attention away from real positions. The instructor dismissed this as overcomplicating things. Military doctrine emphasized concealment, not deception. Jean kept his ideas to himself after that. He learned what the Army taught, followed orders, and prepared for deployment. But in the back of his mind, the decoy principle remained. He knew from thousands of hours hunting that the best concealment was making enemies look somewhere else. Gann shipped to the Pacific in March 1943 with the 24th Infantry Division. His first combat came during the New Guinea campaign, where he served as a standard rifleman in Company B 19th Infantry Regiment. The dense jungle terrain was unlike anything he'd experienced in Nebraska, but the fundamental principles of hunting still applied. During a firefight near Hollandia in April 1944, Jean noticed something interesting. Japanese snipers would fire at American helmet-wearing soldiers, but ignore native workers who sometimes moved through combat zones. The Japanese had learned to identify targets by silhouette, and helmet were the key identifier. Jean experimented. He placed his helmet on a stick and slowly raised it above his fighting position. Japanese fire immediately concentrated on the helmet. While enemy snipers focused on this obvious target, Jean identified their muzzle flashes and called artillery strikes. That eliminated 2 sniper positions. This simple deception worked so well that Jean began developing more elaborate versions. He'd stuff extra uniforms with leaves to create dummy soldiers, position them in exposed locations, and watch where Japanese fire concentrated. The information revealed enemy positions that could then be eliminated. But these were crude decoys, obvious to careful observation. Jean knew from his hunting experience that really effective decoys needed detail, needed movement, needed to look absolutely real. He began thinking about how to apply his waterfall decoy techniques to combat conditions. The opportunity came in October 1944 during the Leh campaign. The 24th Infantry Division landed on Red Beach on October 20th as part of MacArthur's return to the Philippines. Japanese forces had prepared extensive defensive positions, and American casualties were mounting as attacks stalled against determined resistance. Jean's company was pinned down by Japanese fire from a fortified position on a low hill. The enemy had excellent fields of fire, and every American movement drew accurate shooting. The company commander called for artillery, but fire support was limited. Too many units needed support simultaneously. Jean studied the situation. The Japanese position was maybe 250 yards away, well within rifle range, but they had good cover and clear observation. Any American who exposed himself long enough to shoot was immediately targeted by multiple Japanese soldiers. That evening, as his squad prepared defensive positions, Jean had an idea. He gathered bamboo poles that grew abundantly nearby, rice straw from an abandoned field, and a captured Japanese helmet from a previous engagement. Working quietly after dark, he constructed a crude human figure. The Scarecrow was rough but recognizable. Bamboo poles formed a frame suggesting shoulders and head. Rice straw filled out the body shape. The Japanese helmet topped the figure, creating an unmistakable military silhouette. A straight stick extended forward, positioned to look like a rifle. Gan positioned the Scarecrow at dawn, placing it in what appeared to be a hasty sniper position at the edge of the tree cover. To Japanese observers, it would look like an American sniper who'd chosen a poor location, exposed to return fire, but possibly unaware of his vulnerability. Then Jean settled into his actual position, 50 ft away and completely concealed with clear view of the Japanese bunker. He waited. At 0600 hours, Japanese soldiers began emerging for morning routine. An officer appeared, gesturing to subordinates and pointing toward American positions. Through his rifle scope, Jean could see the officer clearly, but he waited. Then it happened. A Japanese soldier spotted the Scarecrow. Jean couldn't hear the words, but he saw the soldier point excitedly toward the decoy. The officer turned, raised binoculars, and studied the fake sniper position carefully. The officer lowered his binoculars and began issuing orders. 2 soldiers took up firing positions, aiming at the Scarecrow. The officer continued watching, probably waiting for the American sniper to fire so they could confirm it was a real threat before wasting ammunition. Jean had his target. The officer stood mostly exposed, confident that his soldiers had spotted the American threat. Gan settled the crosshairs on the officer's chest, compensated for a slight breeze, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle's crack echoed across the battlefield. The Japanese officer fell. Chaos erupted in enemy position as soldiers sought cover, trying to determine where the shot came from. Several Japanese soldiers fired at the Scarecrow, shredding the rice straw and knocking the helmet off its bamboo pole. But Jean was already repositioning. He moved 30 ft to a new location while Japanese attention focused on the destroyed decoy. From his new position, he watched as Japanese soldiers cautiously approached the Scarecrow's position, perhaps expecting to find a dead American sniper. When they discovered it was just bamboo and straw, confusion spread. They'd been deceived, but more importantly, they lost an officer to an enemy they still hadn't located. Jean repeated the technique the next morning. He constructed a new Scarecrow, positioned it in a different location, and waited. Again, Japanese observers spotted the obvious decoy. Again, they focused their attention on this visible threat. Again, Jean took advantage of their distraction to eliminate a target they'd exposed while watching the fake sniper. On the 3rd day, Jean refined his approach. He realized that the decoy didn't need to look perfect. It needed to look like what Japanese soldiers expected to see: an American sniper making a mistake, someone poorly concealed, a target worth shooting at. He began adding small details that enhanced the deception. A canteen hung from the Scarecrow's belt, a small American flag patch visible on the shoulder, slight imperfections in positioning that made it look like an actual soldier rather than an obvious fake. The psychology was perfect. Japanese forces were trained to watch for American snipers. When they spotted something that looked like a poorly concealed sniper, their attention locked onto it. Officers would approach to confirm the threat, study it through binoculars, issue orders about how to eliminate it, all while Jean watched from his actual position, waiting for the perfect shot. By October 20th, Jean had killed 4 Japanese officers using the Scarecrow technique. His company commander, Captain David Morrison, noticed the pattern and called Gan in for explanation. Gan demonstrated his technique, building a Scarecrow in 15 minutes using materials readily available. He explained the decoy principle, how it drew enemy attention away from real threats, how Japanese officers exposed themselves while studying the obvious fake. Captain Morrison was initially skeptical. The technique seemed too simple, too crude to be effective, but the results were undeniable. 4 Japanese officers dead, 0 American casualties, and Jean hadn't revealed his actual firing positions because enemy attention focused entirely on decoys. Morrison authorized Gan to continue his Scarecrow operations. More importantly, he assigned 2 additional snipers to work with Jean, creating multiple real positions supporting each decoy. If Japanese forces did identify Gan's location, the supporting snipers could provide covering fire. Over the next week, Gan perfected his technique. He learned that scarecrows positioned in slightly elevated locations drew more attention, that adding subtle movement achieved through lightweight materials that shifted in the breeze made decoys more convincing, that varying the scarecrow's appearance prevented Japanese forces from recognizing a pattern. Most critically, he learned that Japanese officers were the decoy's most reliable victims. Regular soldiers would spot the scarecrow and take cover, unwilling to expose themselves. But officers, confident in their tactical judgment and eager to direct their men effectively, would study the suspicious position carefully to determine the threat level. This officer-watching behavior created perfect targeting opportunities. Officers would stand exposed, binoculars raised, completely focused on the decoy, while Jean lined up his shot. By the time they realized the scarecrow was fake, it was too late. The psychological impact on Japanese forces was severe. Soldiers began reporting American ghost snipers who appeared and disappeared impossibly. Some claimed Americans had developed camouflage that made them invisible. Others insisted the Americans were using some form of supernatural deception. Japanese commanders receiving reports of officers killed by snipers that couldn't be located initially suspected poor fieldcraft by the victims. But as casualties mounted, they recognized pattern. American forces were using some form of advanced deception technique that consistently fooled experienced observers. By early November, Jean's confirmed kill count using the scarecrow technique had reached 13. All were officers, from junior lieutenants to a major who had made the fatal mistake of studying one of Jean's decoys. Through binoculars for nearly a full minute, while Jean patiently waited for the perfect shot. If you're finding this story as unbelievable as I did researching it, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We uncover the most incredible true stories from World War II that never made it into the history books. These ingenious tactics and forgotten heroes deserve to be remembered. Now, let's continue with how Jean's scarecrow technique reached its devastating peak. The scarecrow technique's effectiveness stemmed from exploiting fundamental aspects of human psychology. Japanese forces were trained to identify threats, and an exposed American sniper was exactly the kind of threat they'd been conditioned to watch for. When they spotted something matching that profile, confirmation bias took over. They saw what they expected to see and stopped looking for alternatives. Jean understood this from hunting. Ducks flying over his decoy spreads weren't stupid. They were responding to visual cues that triggered instinctive behaviors. They saw what looked like other ducks feeding safely. Their threat detection systems relaxed, and they committed to landing. By the time they realized the decoys were fake, they were already in gun range. Japanese officers responding to Jean's scarecrows followed the same pattern. They saw what looked like a poorly concealed American sniper. Their tactical training suggested this was a threat requiring immediate attention, and they focused on confirming and eliminating that threat. Their concentration on the obvious decoy created a blind spot where Jean operated safely. November 3, 1944 brought the technique's most successful single engagement. Gan had positioned a particularly elaborate scarecrow overlooking a Japanese headquarters complex that intelligence had identified through radio intercepts. The location housed a regimental command staff, meaning multiple high V-value U targets would potentially be present. Gan constructed his most detailed scarecrow yet. He used a complete American uniform stuffed carefully to suggest realistic body shape. He positioned the figure in a hasty fighting position behind a fallen log with the helmet at just the right angle to suggest someone peering through a scope. He even added a glint of reflected light achieved by placing a small piece of glass where a rifle scope would be. The scarecrow looked exactly like an American sniper who'd found what he thought was a concealed position, but had actually exposed himself through poor light discipline and inadequate camouflage. Jean's actual position was 70 ft away, completely concealed in dense vegetation with perfect view of the headquarters entrance. He settled in at 04:00 hours and waited. At 05:30 hours, Japanese officers began emerging. First came junior officers conducting routine inspection. Jean watched but didn't fire. He was waiting for the commanders, the senior officers who would make the Headquarters worth targeting. At 0600 hours, a Japanese soldier spotted the Scarecrow. Jean saw the man freeze, then quickly moved to alert a nearby officer. The officer approached cautiously, studied the suspicious position, then hurried into the headquarters building. 2 minutes later, 3 senior officers emerged. Their uniforms and the difference shown by subordinates indicated field-grade officers, probably majors or lieutenant colonels. They gathered near the entrance, and one raised binoculars to study the Scarecrow position. Jean had 3 targets, but he could only shoot one. Before the others took cover, he chose the officer with the binoculars, assuming this was the senior commander. Range was 180 yards, slight crosswind from the right, target stationary. Jean placed the crosshairs on the officer's chest and fired. The Springfield's familiar recoil pushed against his shoulder. Through the scope, he saw the officer fall. The other 2 officers dropped immediately, seeking cover behind the building's foundation. But they'd exposed their position. Jean's 2 supporting snipers, positioned to cover his flanks, had clear shots at the remaining officers. 2 more shots cracked across the jungle. 2 more Japanese officers fell. The engagement lasted perhaps 5 seconds. 3 senior officers dead, the headquarters compound in chaos, and Japanese soldiers firing wildly at the Scarecrow position, shredding the fake sniper while the real shooters remained undetected. Jean and his supporting team withdrew immediately, following their standard procedure of never remaining in position after engagement. By the time Japanese forces organized a response, the Americans were gone, leaving only the destroyed Scarecrow as evidence of their presence. Intelligence analysis later revealed the 3 officers killed that morning were a regimental commander, his executive officer, and the regimental intelligence officer. The loss decapitated the regiment's command structure at a critical moment, contributing to its ineffective response. Subsequent American attacks, November 5th through 12th, brought continuous Scarecrow operations. Jean and his team conducted 8 separate engagements, killing 11 more Japanese officers. The technique's effectiveness hadn't diminished. If anything, it was improving as Jean refined his decoy construction and placement. He learned that Scarecrows positioned near probable Japanese observation posts drew more attention, that decoys visible at dawn or dusk when lighting created shadows and reduced visual clarity were more convincing, that adding small inconsistencies, things like a canteen positioned slightly wrong or a rifle at an awkward angle, actually made decoys more believable by suggesting an inexperienced soldier rather than an artificial construction. But Jean also recognized the technique's limitations. It only worked against enemies who were actively looking for threats. Japanese forces on the move focused on their own operations, rarely noticed the Scarecrows. The technique required enemies to be in defensive positions with time to observe their surroundings. Additionally, the decoys couldn't be reused too frequently in the same area. Japanese forces who had been deceived once became more cautious, studying suspicious positions more carefully before exposing themselves. Jean had to constantly vary his approach, creating different types of decoys and positioning them in unpredictable locations. Weather affected effectiveness. Heavy rain obscured visibility, making Scarecrows less noticeable. Strong winds created too much movement, making the decoys look artificial. Dense fog eliminated the technique entirely since nobody could see the decoys anyway. Most critically, Gan recognized that he was hunting senior officers, and there were only so many in any given area. Unlike shooting regular soldiers where targets were abundant, eliminating officers required patience and selectivity. He couldn't just fire at anyone who appeared. He had to wait for high-value targets worth revealing his position. By mid-November, Japanese commanders in the sector had issued specific warnings about American decoy techniques. Intercepted orders emphasized careful observation before exposing oneself, the use of subordinates to investigate suspicious positions, and immediate reporting of any artificial constructions resembling enemy soldiers. These countermeasures reduced but didn't eliminate the Scarecrow technique's effectiveness. Japanese forces became more cautious, but the fundamental psychology remained. When soldiers saw something that looked like an enemy sniper, their training and instincts demanded they respond. Even knowing about American deception techniques didn't fully immunize them against well-executed decoys. Gene's final Scarecrow engagement occurred on November 20th. He'd positioned a decoy overlooking a supply route where intelligence suggested a Japanese battalion headquarters would be relocating. The Scarecrow was Gene's most sophisticated yet, incorporating subtle features that made it appear to be a sniper in ghillie suit camouflage. At 1,400 hours, the Japanese column appeared. Gan watched through his scope as soldiers moved past carrying equipment and supplies. He waited, knowing that headquarters element typically traveled in the middle of columns for protection. Then he saw them, a group of officers identifiable by their swords and the way subordinates cleared path for them. They were moving quickly, focused on reaching their destination rather than scanning for threats. But one officer stopped. He'd spotted the Scarecrow. Gene saw the officer's head turn, studying the suspicious position. The officer raised his hand, halting the column. He began issuing orders, pointing toward the decoy. Several soldiers took up firing positions, aiming at the Scarecrow, but the officer who'd spotted it moved forward, apparently wanting to investigate personally before ordering his men to fire and potentially reveal their position. Gene tracked the officer through his scope. The man approached to within 100 yards of the Scarecrow, well within certain rifle range. He crouched behind a tree, studying the decoy carefully. Gene could almost see him thinking, trying to determine if this was a real threat or an artificial construction. The officer made his decision. He stood, apparently convinced the figure was fake, and began walking back toward his column. He'd probably concluded it was either an abandoned Scarecrow or an elaborate decoy, and either way didn't warrant wasting ammunition. He was correct, but the conclusion came too late. Gene had waited for exactly this moment when the officer relaxed after identifying the decoy. The shot was 210 YD. The officer walking slowly at an angle, Gene led the target by 3 FD, accounting for movement and distance, and fired. The officer fell. Chaos erupted as Japanese soldiers sought cover, unable to determine where the shot originated. Gene's supporting snipers engaged targets of opportunity, firing 3 more shots that dropped 2 more soldiers before the team withdrew. Later, intelligence analysis couldn't confirm the officer's identity with certainty, but evidence suggested he'd been a battalion commander. Regardless of his specific rank, he was Gene's 21st and final officer killed using the Scarecrow technique. 24th Infantry Division's operations officer reviewing Gene's performance in early December calculated that these 21 officer casualties had significantly disrupted Japanese command effectiveness across an entire division sector. Leadership losses forced promotion of less experienced officers, degraded tactical coordination, and contributed to the disorganization that allowed American forces to advance more rapidly than planned. The Scarecrow technique had achieved results far exceeding what its crude appearance suggested possible. 21 confirmed officer kills, 0 American casualties. During Scarecrow operations, complete tactical surprise maintained throughout the campaign, and psychological impact that forced Japanese forces to expend resources on countermeasures and created pervasive uncertainty about American capabilities. Subscribe to this channel right now if you're enjoying these incredible untold stories from World War II. Hit that bell icon so you never miss our deep dives into the tactics and soldiers that changed history. We're about to explore what happened to Gan after his Scarecrow hunting came to an end. Gene Patterson received the Bronze Star with Valor device for his Scarecrow operations. The citation classified at the time due to the technique's unconventional nature read, for meritorious achievement in connection with military operations against the enemy. Corporal Patterson developed and employed innovative reconnaissance and elimination techniques that resulted in numerous high-value enemy casualties while maintaining complete operational security. His actions contributed materially to the success of division operations. The citation didn't mention Scarecrows. Military bureaucracy apparently couldn't quite process the idea of awarding decorations for farm boy decoy techniques. But everyone in Gan's unit knew what the Bronze Star really recognized. The Scarecrow technique influenced tactical thinking beyond Gan's personal employment. Other snipers in the 24th Infantry Division began experimenting with decoy methods. Some worked, many didn't. The technique required specific skills, careful execution, and tactical judgment that not everyone possessed. Captain Morrison submitted a detailed after-action report describing the Scarecrow technique and recommending its inclusion in sniper training doctrine. The report acknowledged the method's limitations, but argued that its effectiveness justified formal instruction. Military bureaucracy moved slowly. The report was forwarded up the chain of command, studied by various staff officers, and eventually incorporated into classified lessons learned documents, but formal training programs weren't modified during the war. The technique remained an unconventional approach that individual snipers could choose to employ, but wouldn't be officially taught. Gene continued combat operations through the Philippines campaign. His total confirmed kill count reached 47 by war's end, with 21 coming from Scarecrow-assisted engagements. This ratio demonstrated the technique's remarkable efficiency. Using decoys, Gene achieved nearly half his total kills while taking minimal risks compared to conventional sniping. Japanese response to the Scarecrow technique revealed interesting psychological dimensions. Intercepted communications showed Japanese forces struggling to understand American deception methods. Some reports attributed the decoys to advanced technology, perhaps radio-controlled devices or elaborate mechanical constructions. The idea that Americans were using crude bamboo and straw figures seemed too unsophisticated for Japanese intelligence to credit. They assumed their enemies possessed technological advantages, not superior understanding of basic deception psychology. This misperception prevented effective countermeasures, since Japanese forces were looking for complex solutions to a simple problem. One captured Japanese officer interrogated in December 1944 provided revealing testimony about the Scarecrow technique's psychological impact. He stated, "Our soldiers became afraid to investigate suspicious positions. Every visible enemy might be fake, hiding the real shooter somewhere else. Officers couldn't direct operations effectively because showing oneself to study enemy positions invited sniper fire from unexpected directions. The Americans had turned our own vigilance against us. This assessment captured the technique's essential genius. It weaponized the enemy's own alertness, making their careful observation of threats into the mechanism of their destruction." The more carefully Japanese officers studied the decoys, the more exposed they became to Gan's actual firing position. After Japan's surrender in August 1945, Gene returned to Nebraska. He married his childhood sweetheart, Dorothy Jensen, on September 22, 1945. They purchased a farm adjacent to his family's property and returned to agricultural life. Gene resumed waterfowl hunting using the same decoy techniques he'd employed before the war. Friends and family noticed he rarely discussed his military service. When asked about combat experiences, he'd respond simply that he'd done his duty and was glad to be home. But those close to him recognized changes. His younger brother, Robert, interviewed in 1996, recalled, "Gene would wake up screaming sometimes. Dorothy told me he had nightmares about Japanese officers he'd killed. He never hunted alone after the war. I think the solitude reminded him too much of combat." Gene's relationship with scarecrows changed after the war. His father wanted to put up scarecrows to protect crops from birds, but Gene refused. He told his family the farm didn't need them, that other methods would work better. He never explained why, but Dorothy understood. The scarecrows reminded him of things he preferred to forget. In 1953, a military historian writing about sniper operations in the Pacific tracked Gene, requesting an interview. Gene initially refused, but eventually agreed to one meeting on condition nothing be published during his lifetime. The interview notes, now archived at the Army Heritage Center, show Gan describing the Scarecrow technique in detail. He explained the decoy principle, demonstrated proper scarecrow construction, and discussed the psychological factors that made it effective, but he repeatedly emphasized that he took no pride in developing the technique. When asked how he felt about killing 21 Japanese officers using decoys, Gene's response was revealing. "Those officers would have killed American soldiers if they'd lived. My job was stopping them. The scarecrows were just tools. I don't feel guilty about using effective tools, but I don't feel proud either. Pride suggests there's something noble about killing. There isn't. It's just something that had to be done. Regarding whether the decoy technique was ethical, Jean stated, "War isn't about fair fighting. It's about winning while losing as few of your own people as possible. The scarecrows helped me kill enemy officers without getting my men killed. That's ethical enough for combat. Whether it's ethical in any broader sense, I don't know. I'll leave that for philosophers to argue." Jean's farming career proved successful. He pioneered several agricultural innovations, served on county committees, and mentored young farmers. His community knew him as a knowledgeable agriculturalist and good neighbor. Few realized they were living near a man who developed one of World War II's most innovative sniper techniques. He never commercially manufactured decoys despite his expertise. When asked why, he told friends that he'd lost interest in the hobby. In truth, as Dorothy revealed years later, Gant couldn't look at artificial human figures without remembering the scarecrows that had drawn Japanese officers to their deaths. Thomas Eugene Patterson died on July the 12th, 2001, at age 79. His obituary in the Kearney Hub mentioned his military service in a single sentence, noting he'd served in the Pacific Theater and received the Bronze Star. Most readers had no idea they were reading about the Scarecrow sniper. His funeral was attended by over 300 people, mostly farming families and veterans who knew him as a quiet man who served his country and built a good life. Only a handful of aging soldiers understood the significance of his wartime innovations. None mentioned the scarecrows. Jean had requested no military honors beyond the flag on his casket. His military decorations and papers were donated to the National World War II Museum. The collection includes his Bronze Star. Citation: After-action reports from November 1944, and photographs showing Jean demonstrating scarecrow construction. These materials provide the most complete documentation of the technique's development and employment. Military historians examining Jean's scarecrow technique have identified several factors that enabled its success. First, his childhood experience building waterfowl decoys created expertise that military training couldn't replicate. He understood deception psychology at an intuitive level that came only from thousands of hours, observing how targets responded to artificial constructions. Second, the specific tactical conditions of Philippine jungle warfare suited the technique perfectly. Dense vegetation provided concealment for the actual sniper while allowing the decoy to be positioned in partially exposed locations. The static nature of Japanese defensive positions gave officers time to observe and study suspicious objects. The Imperial Army's emphasis on officer leadership made senior commanders more likely to personally investigate potential threats. Third, Jean possessed the psychological characteristics necessary for sustained sniper operations. Patience to wait hours for the perfect shot. Discipline to let less valuable targets pass while waiting for officers. Emotional detachment that allowed viewing humans as tactical problems requiring elimination. These traits can't be taught. They're inherent to certain individuals. Fourth, Japanese tactical culture inadvertently supported the technique's effectiveness. The emphasis on personal leadership meant officers would expose themselves to direct subordinates. The focus on collective decision-making meant multiple officers would gather to discuss responses to perceived threats. These behavioral patterns created target-rich opportunities when officers responded to decoys. Finally, the technique succeeded through simplicity. More complex approaches would have required resources, coordination, and approval that combat conditions didn't allow. But crude bamboo and straw figures could be constructed anywhere with materials readily available. The decoys required no special equipment, no technical support, no logistics chain. Just one clever soldier with understanding of how to make enemies see what they expected to see. The legacy of Jean Patterson's scarecrow technique extends beyond his personal kill count. The method demonstrated that effective military innovations don't always require advanced technology or extensive resources. Sometimes the best solutions come from understanding human psychology and exploiting enemy expectations. Modern military deception Doctrine incorporates principles that Gene discovered through trial and error. The recognition that making enemies focus on false threats is often more valuable than hiding real ones. That decoys should look like what enemies expect to find, not necessarily what's actually most realistic. That effective deception requires understanding the target's thought process and creating illusions that trigger their trained responses. Special operations forces worldwide employ decoy techniques for various purposes. Dummy positions that draw enemy fire, false radio traffic that suggests forces where none exist, inflatable equipment that creates illusions of military strength. All these methods trace conceptual lineage to soldiers like Gan, who recognize that sometimes the most powerful weapon is making enemies see what isn't there. For hunters and wildlife photographers, Gan's decoy innovations remain relevant. The principles he applied, creating movement, adding realistic details, positioning decoys where targets expect to find them. These techniques continue working because they exploit fundamental aspects of animal perception and behavior. The question of whether Gene Patterson was a hero has no simple answer. He killed 21 enemy officers, saving unknown numbers of American lives by disrupting Japanese command effectiveness. He developed an innovative technique that enhanced American combat capabilities. He served courageously in some of the Pacific's deadliest campaigns. By conventional measures, these achievements certainly qualify as heroic. But Gene himself rejected hero status. He viewed his actions as necessary rather than noble, practical rather than glorious. The idea that deceiving and killing Japanese officers deserved celebration made him uncomfortable. He'd done his job, used the skills his farming background provided, and tried to minimize American casualties in the process, nothing more. Perhaps the most honest assessment comes from his son, Michael, who spoke at a veterans event in 2008. "My father was a problem solver. During the war, the problem was Japanese officers who would kill Americans if they weren't stopped. Dad's solution used knowledge from his childhood, understanding how decoys could manipulate behavior. He applied that knowledge effectively, which made him competent. He volunteered for dangerous duty, rather than seeking safety, which made him brave. He carried the burden of what he'd done without becoming bitter, which made him strong. Whether that adds up to heroic is for others to decide. He would have said he just did what needed doing." The Scarecrow sniper story resonates because it challenges assumptions about military innovation and effectiveness. We expect combat advances to come from weapons laboratories and engineering departments. The idea that a Nebraska farmer would develop one of the Pacific War's most effective sniper techniques using methods learned hunting ducks seems improbable, yet that's exactly what happened. Gene Patterson, using knowledge his grandfather taught him about waterfowl decoys, created a combat innovation that killed 21 Japanese officers while saving countless American lives. The Scarecrow technique succeeded not despite its simplicity, but because of it. Sometimes the best solution is one that nobody thought to try because it seemed too basic. His story reminds us that expertise can come from unexpected places, that practical knowledge can prove more valuable than theoretical understanding, that questioning conventional approaches can reveal better methods, that simple tools properly employed by skilled users can outperform complex systems. Gene Patterson, the Nebraska farmer who killed 21 Japanese officers using scarecrows, never sought recognition or fame. He developed his technique to solve a tactical problem, employed it effectively, then quietly returned to farming. He lived and died as a modest man who happened to possess extraordinary understanding of deception psychology. Those skills, developed through childhood hunting and refined through combat experience, made him one of World War II's most innovative snipers. His scarecrow technique, initially dismissed by some as too crude to be effective, proved devastatingly successful in combat. His willingness to employ unconventional methods gave him advantages that changed battle outcomes. They called him the Scarecrow Sniper, as if it were a nickname rather than a description of revolutionary combat technique. But those 21 Japanese officers killed in October and November 1944 discovered too late that Gene Patterson's farm boy decoys were deadly serious. The Nebraska farmer had brought waterfowl hunting techniques to Philippine jungles, and the Imperial Japanese Army had no answer. In the end, Gene's greatest achievement wasn't his confirmed kill count or his tactical innovations. It was his ability to remain fundamentally himself despite warfare's brutality. He entered combat as a skilled hunter and ethical man. He fought effectively when necessary. Then he returned to being a farmer and neighbor, carrying his experiences privately without letting them define him publicly. The Scarecrow technique worked because Gan understood that sometimes the best weapon isn't what kills the enemy. It's what makes the enemy expose themselves to be killed. A crude bamboo figure with a rice straw body became the bait that drew Japanese officers into an Iowa farmer's sights. Farm boy ingenuity proved more effective than military technology. 21 Japanese officers in 16 days, 47 total confirmed kills, 0 American casualties under his protection. These numbers tell part of Gene Patterson's story, but the full story lies in understanding how a Nebraska farmer's hunting knowledge became one of World War II's most innovative combat techniques, proving that genius can emerge from the most ordinary backgrounds. Sometimes, the greatest military innovations come not from generals or engineers, but from farm boys who understand that hunting humans isn't fundamentally different from hunting ducks. You just need the right decoy in the right place, and nature takes its course. Gene Patterson understood this truth, and 21 Japanese officers paid the price for their commander's failure to imagine that American snipers might fight using scarecrows built from bamboo and rice straw.